Something appeared in orbit on February 9th without launching from Earth. No rocket signature, no flight path, just there, 827 kilometers up, moving at 74 kilometers per second, and we had absolutely no record it existed. Before I explain what happened next, hit subscribe to Battleground Times. You need to hear this complete story. Drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from, because what I'm about to share challenges everything we understand about orbital mechanics. My name was Colonel at NORAD. 14 years tracking satellites, Russian birds, Chinese platforms, space debris, anything that moved above the atmosphere. I knew orbital signatures like other people know faces, could identify hardware by radar return alone. But February 9th broke every pattern I'd ever learned. The operations center sat deep inside Cheyenne Mountain, behind blast doors weighing 25 tons each. Chambers carved from solid granite, built to survive nuclear war. We monitored everything, every satellite, every piece of junk bigger than a softball, 20,000 tracked objects, updated constantly. When something new appeared, we knew within seconds, usually 12 hours, night shift. My team was running standard monitoring. We'd just tracked a Russian reconnaissance bird, documented debris from an old Chinese weapons test, standard stuff, routine. Then the displays changed, not gradually, not something drifting into range, just suddenly there, new contact. Unknown. No identification data, just raw numbers showing something occupied space that should be empty. The analyst called it out immediately. Unknown contact. 84.7 kilometers altitude, velocity 74 kilometers per second, inclination 63 degrees. His voice had that edge. That tension you hear when someone spots something wrong. I moved to his station, verified the data myself. The return was solid, bright, clear, something with significant size, but zero identification tags. Every satellite in our database showed tagging information, orbital parameters. This thing? Nothing. Like it didn't exist in any record. Like space itself had generated something from nothing. I ordered identification protocols. The system searched our comprehensive database, every registered satellite, every known object. The search ran, came back negative. I expanded parameters, checked decommissioned birds, old debris fields, anything that might have decayed into that orbital slot. Still nothing. We were tracking something real. Multiple systems confirmed it. But according to every database, every launch manifest, every record, that patch of space was empty. The civilian scientist on duty analyzed the orbital parameters, studied the radar signature, gave me an assessment that made the situation worse. Based on size and velocity, we were tracking something approximately 5 meters across, not tumbling randomly like debris, maintaining stable orbit, station keeping, active control, and the orbit was too stable for something that'd been decaying for years. His conclusion? This hardware was placed recently, within months, maybe weeks, that created immediate problems. We monitor all launches. Every nation putting hardware up notifies through international channels, has to. Unannounced launches trigger military responses. But if something this size launched recently, we would have detected it. The thermal signature alone, the trajectory. You can't secretly boost 5 meters of metal to 8047 kilometers, not without everyone seeing it happen. I asked the question anyway. Could it have launched without detection? The senior analyst joined our discussion, pulled up spectral analysis, radar return characteristics. His conclusion matched the scientist's concern. The signature was wrong, too uniform. Most satellites show irregular returns. Solar panels, antennas, equipment booms. This looks spherical, almost perfectly round. That shape is rare in orbit, inefficient for modern satellites. We only see spheres in very old hardware or very specialized research equipment. This matched neither category. I opened secure communications to Space Command. Unknown orbital contact, no launch detection, no database match, characteristics inconsistent with known hardware. He asked the critical question, threat assessment or tracking error? I gave him honesty. Unknown. The object is real, multiple systems confirm, but nothing about it makes sense. He authorized additional sensors, optical systems for visual identification, intelligence consultation. If this was foreign hardware, we needed to know who launched it and why we missed it. The next 4 hours we gathered data. tasked ground telescopes, coordinated with Allied stations, pulled launch manifests going back months. Everything came back negative or inconclusive. Optical observations showed something reflective, metallic construction, but resolution wasn't good enough for details. Allied stations confirmed our tracking, same radar signature, same confusion. Launch records showed nothing. Not one mission that could account for hardware in that specific slot. One analyst said it plainly. Like this thing just appeared. No launch, no deployment from existing platforms, no decay from higher orbit, just there. He was right. That was exactly what disturbed me. In orbital mechanics, nothing just appears. Everything follows physics, gets launched from ground, deployed from stations, follows trajectories you can calculate. But this object violated that principle, existed without origin. The scientists ran calculations for hours, tried to model any scenario explaining the object's presence, secret launch avoiding detection, deployment from the space station, classified programs using unknown insertion methods. None worked. The math didn't support any conventional explanation. Orbital parameters didn't match launch trajectories from the past 6 months. The altitude and inclination would require boosters from sites that don't exist. His conclusion was disturbing. Either our tracking data is corrupted and we're seeing ghosts, or something placed hardware in orbit through methods we can't detect. Both options were unacceptable. Our systems are redundant, cross-verified constantly, all showing the same artifact, probability essentially zero. But the alternative meant something could reach orbit without detection, meant our entire surveillance capability had blind spots, gaps we didn't know existed, that threatened the whole mission, space domain awareness, threat detection, everything NORAD was built to do. The object's second orbital pass made things worse. We'd calculated its trajectory, positioned sensors to observe the next revolution. But when it came around, position was off. 12 kilometers from predicted track. In orbital mechanics, that's enormous. Our tracking is precise to meters. 12 kilometers deviation means either our data was catastrophically wrong, or the object maneuvered. The analyst called it out. Contact reacquired. Position divergent from predicted track by 12 kilometers. I immediately asked about propulsion, active burns, thermal signatures. The scientists checked the data. No thermal bloom, no exhaust plume, but orbital parameters definitely changed. Altitude increased 4 kilometers. Velocity decreased slightly. The object maneuvered without detectable propulsion. That's impossible. Satellites change orbit by firing thrusters. Creates heat signatures we detect from ground. Orbital changes require energy, has to come from somewhere. You can't just shift altitude without burning fuel. Yet the data clearly showed the object moved, changed its orbital slot, while showing zero indicators of engine burns. One officer suggested solar pressure. Sunlight creates tiny thrust over time. The scientist shot it down immediately. Solar pressure is too weak, orders of magnitude insufficient. For 4 kilometers altitude, change in 2 hours would need weeks or months. This wasn't drift. Without visible means of propulsion. I contacted Space Command again. Briefed the general on new developments. His response was immediate. B for potential threat. Be an intelligence involved immediately. Someone knows what this is. Even if we don't, within the hour, an intelligence agent arrived. Won't say which agency. That's above classification of this account. But he had access to information about black programs, classified space capabilities even NORAD doesn't routinely see. He reviewed our tracking data silently, then asked about signals intelligence. Any transmissions we'd collected. We detected nothing. No radio signals, no data links, no communication with ground controllers. Listening rather than transmitting? That was smart. Most satellites broadcast data, but reconnaissance platforms sometimes operate passive, collect information without transmitting, avoid detection. If this was intelligence gathering, it might be designed to minimize signatures. Possible, I admitted. But that doesn't explain how it reached orbit without launch detection. The agent was quiet, then said something that made it worse. There are black programs, classified capabilities NORAD isn't briefed on. What you're tracking might be one of those. I asked the obvious question. Then why weren't we notified? We have protocols for classified assets. They're tagged friendly. Prevents exactly this confusion. His answer chilled me. Because the programs I'm discussing are classified at levels where even tagging protocols would reveal too much. If this is what I think, officially it doesn't exist, which means officially you're not tracking it. He was suggesting us intelligence put hardware up without telling Space Surveillance Command, that we were treating our own satellite as a threat because nobody informed us it existed. That conversation happened at 0847 hours. By 0900 he'd made calls, returned with an expression that said his theory was wrong, checked every black program with space capability. None have hardware in that slot. None launched anything recently matching what we're seeing. This isn't ours. Then whose? Unknown. But you're not the first to observe this. Other sightings over past 3 weeks, different orbital tracks, similar characteristics. Something is placing hardware in orbit, and we have no idea how. That revelation changed everything. This wasn't isolated. This was pattern. Multiple objects appearing without launches, maneuvering without propulsion, exhibiting characteristics that matched no known hardware. Someone had developed orbital capability that bypassed every detection system, every monitoring network, every surveillance protocol we'd built over decades. Over the next 12 hours, we observed 3 more passes. Each time, the object shifted position from predicted track, never dramatically, but consistently deviating. We documented enough data to establish pattern. Sun synchronous orbit, crosses same ground points at same local solar time daily, common for reconnaissance satellites, provides consistent lighting for imaging. But the maneuvers weren't consistent with reconnaissance. Wasn't adjusting to pass over specific targets, wasn't maintaining station over areas of interest. Movement seemed random, or followed logic we couldn't discern from observation alone. The scientists noticed something else. The radar cross-section is changing, getting larger and smaller periodically. About 20% variation. Definitely cycling. That shouldn't be possible unless it's changing shape or orientation. We analyzed the return data, confirmed his observation. The object's apparent size oscillated, not astronomical, not standard satellite behavior, like the object was deliberately modulating its signature for unknown purpose. One officer suggested rotation. If not perfectly spherical, rotation would vary the cross-section as different surfaces faced our sensors. We calculated required rotation rate. Came out wrong. Object would need to spin far faster than any satellite we'd tracked. Such rotation should destabilize the orbit, cause degradation. But the orbit remained stable. By 200 hours, we'd accumulated comprehensive tracking data. I prepared a report, documented the object's characteristics. Impossible orbital insertion, unexplained maneuvers, changing radar signature. The assessment troubled me writing it. Based on available data, tracked object exhibits characteristics inconsistent with known orbital hardware. Origin unidentified, despite exhaustive search. Behavior suggests active intelligence. Capability for maneuver without detectable propulsion. Recommend continued tracking and escalation to national security leadership. The general reviewed my report. Made a decision that classified this entire incident at levels ensuring almost nobody would ever know. Your tracking is terminated immediately. The object is now under special access protocols. All data you've collected is being seized. You and your team will sign non-disclosure agreements. Prohibit discussion with anyone, including other NORAD personnel. This is being handled above Space Command Authority. I wanted to argue. Point out that abandoning tracking violated every protocol, every mission requirement. But I recognized when orders weren't negotiable. Whatever we'd observed triggered classification above NORAD's authority, above Space Command. Someone decided we weren't supposed to know what we weren't tracking. The non-disclosure agreements we signed were the most restrictive I'd encountered. 14 years of classified work. These were different. Prohibited discussion with any personnel lacking specific clearance. Violation meant revocation of all clearances. Federal prosecution, potential life imprisonment. The official story became simple. Atmospheric disturbances created anomalous radar returns. Technical analysis determined returns were artifacts. Calibration procedures implemented to prevent similar false contacts. Nothing to see. move along. But I couldn't forget, couldn't dismiss data verified by multiple systems, observed by trained personnel who knew real contacts from sensor ghosts. Whatever appeared on February 9th was real, and immediate classification suggested someone in leadership knew exactly what it was, and decided NORAD didn't need to know. I returned to routine duties, tracked Russian satellites, Chinese orbital platforms, space debris from old weapons tests, filed reports on known objects following predictable orbits, standard physics. But I started paying attention to gaps, times when monitoring coverage showed anomalies, not equipment failures, something different, deliberate exclusions from our displays, and I found a pattern every 17 days. Give or take 6 hours. Brief periods where tracking systems showed reduced coverage in specific orbital slots. Each gap lasted approximately 40 minutes, occurred in different orbital planes. But the timing was too consistent for coincidence, creating blind spots, temporarily preventing us from observing specific portions of space. They were doing it on a schedule. That suggested ongoing operations, not one-time events. Regular activity that required keeping NORAD blind at predictable intervals. I couldn't investigate officially. The agreements I'd signed prohibited even acknowledging there was anything to investigate. But I could observe patterns in public data, draw conclusions without accessing classified tracking organizations' published data. Amateur radio operators track satellites by monitoring transmissions, calculating orbits from signal timing. These civilian sources lack NORAD's precision, can't match our comprehensive coverage, but they can detect large objects in low orbit. Document changes in known satellite positions. I started monitoring civilian tracking reports, found references to observations matching the timing of our gaps. Amateur trackers reporting brief radar returns from apparently empty orbital slots. Commercial services noting unexplained variations in known satellite orbits, like they were maneuvering to avoid something not showing in public databases. None of these civilian sources knew what they observed. They documented anomalies, lacked capability to investigate further, didn't know they were seeing patterns, but collectively, their observations confirmed something. The object we tracked wasn't unique. There were others. Multiple orbital contacts appearing and disappearing on schedules, while our official systems either couldn't or wouldn't detect them. 3 weeks after the February incident, one of my former analysts approached me privately, off-duty period, recreation area where conversations couldn't be monitored. Security systems that recorded everything in operational sections didn't reach there. He needed to ask something off the record. I knew immediately what. I told him carefully, if your question relates to events covered by non-disclosure agreements, you know I can't discuss it, he rephrased, not asking to violate anything. Asking if I'd noticed patterns in monitoring data, patterns suggesting we're not seeing complete orbital coverage. I chose words carefully, technically accurate but uninformative. Monitoring systems function according to parameters set by Space Command. If there are gaps, they're operational decisions made above our authority, he pressed. What if those decisions prevent us from detecting threats? What if something operates in orbital space and we're deliberately kept from tracking it? I gave him the only answer possible. Then that's a command decision based on classified information we're not cleared for. Our job is monitor what we're authorized to monitor, report what we're authorized to report. Everything else is above our clearance level. He looked frustrated. I understood completely. He'd been trained to track threats, defend against orbital dangers, and told to ignore potential contacts because they're classified, went against every instinct, against everything that made him effective at his job. He said it plainly, that's not sufficient. If objects in orbit pose potential threats to us assets, we need tracking them, regardless of classification. The whole point of NORAD is comprehensive space surveillance. He was right. Being right doesn't matter when dealing with classification that supersedes operational mission. I told him to note it in his personal log if he felt it important, but don't pursue through official channels. That would violate protocols in place for reasons neither of us are cleared to understand. The conversation ended with both of us knowing we'd acknowledged something we weren't supposed to discuss. But I'd given him enough information. The patterns he noticed were real. Investigating them would be career-ending, possibly legally dangerous. The next major incident occurred March 14th. wasn't on duty. But another lieutenant contacted me at Air Force told me something significant happened. Need you in operations center immediately. We have a situation requiring your authorization. I arrived within 15 minutes. Space Surveillance Center in heightened alert status. Multiple analysts focused on tracking displays, showing orbital data that looked routine, but apparently wasn't. I ordered a report. The lieutenant pulled up tracking data. At 0342 hours, we detected what appeared to be debris fragmentation event. 9,203 kilometers altitude. Multiple pieces, initially assessed as satellite breakup, collision, or internal failure. But when we attempted correlating the debris field with known orbital objects, we found nothing. No satellite in that slot, no recent collision reports. The debris appeared from nowhere. I studied the tracking data, feeling that same impossible reality from February. Debris fields don't spontaneously generate in orbit. They result from collisions between existing objects, or deliberate destructions. Anti-satellite tests. But this fragmentation showed dozens of pieces that hadn't come from any identifiable source. Did we observe the actual fragmentation, or just detect the resulting debris? Just the debris field appeared suddenly on displays, as if something broke up moments earlier. But we have no tracking data showing any object in that location before fragmentation occurred. That was impossible by the same logic that made February impossible. Satellites don't just appear. Neither does debris from breakup. Everything in space has history. Trajectory traced back to launch or deployment. But this debris field existed without origin. I called for the civilian scientist immediately. He arrived within minutes, probably working late on other projects. He analyzed the debris field data with methodical precision. His conclusion equally disturbing. This pattern is consistent with explosive fragmentation. Something approximately 3 meters diameter broke apart with significant force, creating debris field now spreading along the original orbital path. But velocity vectors don't make sense. How? The debris pieces are moving at velocities suggesting ejection from source, with more force than any known satellite breakup produces. Like something exploded with energy that shouldn't be possible from battery failures or impact events. This looks like intentional destruction, with explosive charges. Anti-satellite test, I suggested. Though I knew that didn't fit, no nation conducting tests does so without warning, and debris characteristics don't match known weapons. This is something else. Something that was in orbit, didn't show on tracking systems, then destroyed itself, or was destroyed by means that don't match any known orbital weapon. I opened secure communications to Space Command. Briefed the duty officer on observations. His response was immediate and familiar. Stand by for classification protocols. Within the hour, the intelligence agent was back, reviewing debris tracking data. Expression suggested he'd been expecting something like this. I asked him directly, "Is this related to what we tracked in February?" Officially, this is a separate incident. No connection to any previous classified events. His tone made clear he was reciting required language, not expressing actual assessment. Unofficially, you're tracking a pattern. Objects appearing without launch detection, maneuvering without visible propulsion, now apparently capable of self-destruction that doesn't match known deorbiting procedures. So what are they? That's above my clearance. I know these incidents are occurring, know they're being classified at highest levels, but I don't know what's actually up there, or why national security leadership decided NORAD doesn't need comprehensive information about it. I said what we both knew. That's insane. How can we defend against orbital threats if we're not allowed to track them? His expression suggested he'd asked the same question, received answers he couldn't share. The decision has been made that tracking these objects creates more operational security risks than not tracking them. Whether that makes sense depends on information neither of us has access to. Are they foreign, Chinese, Russian? He couldn't answer, or wouldn't. Because honestly, I don't know. The classification protocols are structured to prevent anyone from assembling complete picture. You're allowed to know objects exist. I'm allowed to know they're being monitored at higher levels. But neither of us gets the full story about what they are or where they come from. That conversation revealed more than his actual words. The classification structure wasn't designed to protect sources and methods. It was designed to ensure no single person could understand complete truth. about what was operating in Earth orbit. The debris field remained trackable for 3 days. Then something equally impossible occurred. Gathered. The scientists said it plainly. We tracked the clustering process for 16 hours. Dozens of debris pieces that should have been spreading into wider dispersion instead converged on a single point, and then they vanished, not decaying into lower orbit, just disappearing from tracking systems, as if they ceased to exist. Equipment malfunction, one lieutenant suggested, without conviction. All tracking systems showing same malfunction simultaneously, I responded. We've been through this before. You know that's not what we're seeing. What we were seeing was something that had been in orbit, had fragmented either accidentally or deliberately, then somehow reconstituted itself before disappearing from our ability to track it. That sequence violated every principle of orbital mechanics, every understanding of satellite operations, every physical law governing space domain. This incident was classified even faster than previous ones. Within hours of the debris disappearing, we received orders terminating tracking, classification of all related data, locations updated with additional restrictions, specifically prohibited discussion of satellite fragmentation events that couldn't be correlated to known orbital objects. But this time, I wasn't the only one noticing patterns. Another major approached me 2 days later, information he'd clearly been compiling despite risks of investigating classified incidents. He'd been reviewing historical tracking data. With appropriate security permissions, he added quickly, found evidence these incidents have been occurring for at least 8 months. Probably longer if you go back far enough in the archives, I warned him. That's sensitive territory. You understand the classification issues with this topic. He pressed forward. I understand we're responsible for space surveillance, and we're being systematically prevented from doing our jobs. These objects represent gaps in our coverage, blind spots that could be exploited by actual threats, and we're being told to ignore them. He pulled up data on Secure Terminal, showed gaps in tracking coverage going back almost a year. Each gap corresponding to times when objects should have been observable, but weren't recorded in databases. Frequency of gaps had been increasing, from once every few months to multiple times per week in recent data. This isn't sustainable, he said. Either we're experiencing systematic equipment failures across all redundant systems, which is physically impossible, or something is operating in orbital space and we're being prevented from tracking it. Either way, that's critical vulnerability. I asked what he wanted me to do with this information. Brief Space Command. Tell them operational capability is being compromised by classification protocols that prevent tracking known contacts. This isn't about violating agreements or investigating classified programs. This is about maintaining surveillance mission NORAD was created to perform. He was right, but naive about how classification structures work. The decision to exclude these objects from tracking wasn't operational error. It was deliberate policy, implemented at levels that didn't answer to Space Command, didn't care about NORAD's monitoring gaps. I'll pass your concerns up the chain, but don't expect action. The classification around these incidents isn't accidental. Someone decided we're not supposed to know what we're not tracking. Until that decision changes, we follow orders. Monitor what we're authorized to monitor. That conversation occurred on March 29th. By April 3rd, the pattern had escalated to a point where ignoring it became impossible, even within the constraints of our classification protocols. We detected multiple objects simultaneously, not just one unknown contact like in February, but 7 separate orbital signatures appearing in low Earth orbit within a 15-minute period. Maneuvering without visible propulsion, and radar cross-sections that varied in the same 43-minute cycle we'd observed in the original contact. This isn't random anymore, the captain said as we tracked the multiple contacts. This is coordinated. Someone is deploying orbital hardware on a schedule, and they're using capabilities that bypass every detection system we have. The 7 objects maintained formation for approximately 2 hours, moving in synchronized orbits that required constant communication and navigation corrections. Then they began what could only be described as a demonstration. Each object performed maneuvers that showcased capabilities far beyond any known satellite technology. One changed altitude by 40 kilometers in less than 3 minutes without showing any thermal signature from rocket propulsion. Another shifted orbital inclination by 15 degrees, which should require enormous fuel expenditure but showed no exhaust plume or reaction mass. A third came to what appeared to be a complete stop relative to Earth's surface, hovering at 805 kilometers altitude, in defiance of orbital mechanics that require constant velocity to maintain altitude. The scientist watched these maneuvers with an expression approaching shock. "This is impossible. You can't stop in orbit. You can't change inclination without massive delta V. These objects are violating conservation of momentum. They're maneuvering as if Newton's laws don't apply to them." Could there be propulsion technology we're not detecting? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Not possible. Any propulsion system that could perform these maneuvers would create signatures we can detect: thermal emissions from rocket engines, electromagnetic fields from ion drives. Even exotic propulsion concepts like nuclear thermal would show observable effects. These objects are changing velocity and trajectory without any detectable mechanism for producing thrust. The demonstration continued for 3 hours, 7 objects performing maneuvers that showcased capabilities beyond human technology, operating in formation that required coordination and control systems we couldn't detect, and doing all of it in full view of our tracking systems, as if deliberately showing us what they could do, and then they vanished. Not individually over time, but all 7 simultaneously at 0847 hours. One moment they were on our displays, maintaining formation and performing impossible maneuvers. The next moment, empty orbital space, with no indication that anything had ever been there. The classification response was immediate and comprehensive. Before I could even finish compiling my initial report, orders came down, terminating all tracking, seizing every piece of data we'd collected. The non-disclosure agreements were updated again, with language so restrictive that I couldn't even confirm whether the incident had occurred if asked by personnel with lower clearances. But this time, the classification came with additional instructions. Transferred out of NORAD to a position that removed me from space tracking operations. The official explanation was routine rotation for career development. The actual reason was obvious. I'd seen too much, observed too many incidents that officially didn't exist. And rather than continue to brief me on events I wasn't supposed to acknowledge, they were moving me to where I wouldn't be exposed to ongoing developments. The other major was reassigned 2 days later, the captain 3 days after that, the lieutenant within the week. All of us transferred to different commands, different responsibilities, different missions that had nothing to do with space surveillance. The team that had observed multiple impossible incidents was being systematically dispersed, to ensure we couldn't compare notes or develop collective understanding of patterns we'd witnessed. The civilian scientist, the contractor, was released from his consulting position, with explanation that his expertise was no longer required for current NORAD projects. He contacted me before leaving the facility, requesting a private conversation that I knew would violate multiple classification protocols, but that I agreed to anyway, because I needed to understand if his conclusions matched mine. "We witnessed something that challenges fundamental physics," he said when we met. "Objects operating in orbital space through mechanisms we don't understand, performing maneuvers that shouldn't be possible, and apparently able to appear and disappear without regard for the physical laws that govern everything else in the universe." "What's your scientific assessment?" I asked. "We're observing technology from sources that have mastered physical principles we haven't discovered. Neither option is comforting, because if physics is incomplete, that means we've been wrong about basic reality. And if this is advanced technology, then whoever developed it has capabilities so far beyond human engineering that we might as well be comparing stone tools to nuclear weapons. Could it be classified human technology? Some black program that's achieved breakthroughs we're not aware of?" He shook his head. "The technology gap is too large. You don't go from conventional satellites to physics-violating orbital platforms in one generation of development. If this is human technology, it required scientific foundations that don't exist in any published physics research. It would mean someone made discoveries that revolutionize our understanding of reality, and kept them completely secret while developing operational capabilities. That's possible, theoretically, but improbable. The more likely explanation, though it's one I never thought I'd seriously consider, is that we're observing technology from non-human sources, from civilizations or entities that have scientific knowledge far beyond human capability." That assessment matched my own conclusions, though I'd been reluctant to articulate it even in my own thoughts. The objects we'd observed didn't behave like any human technology. They operated according to principles that suggested either revolutionary physics or non-human engineering, and the fact that they were being classified and suppressed rather than investigated suggested that someone in national security leadership had reached the same conclusion and decided that public knowledge would create problems worse than remaining ignorant. I'm recording this testimony 6 months after my reassignment from NORAD. The facility I'm in now doesn't have a public name. It's where personnel who've been exposed to classified information that requires controlled management are processed before being released back into general military service or retired from active duty. I've spent these months in debriefings that carefully catalog everything I observed while ensuring I understand the consequences of unauthorized disclosure. Every detail of my exposure to incidents that officially never occurred, and in exchange for my cooperation, they've promised that my career won't be destroyed, my security clearances will be maintained at appropriate levels, and I'll be able to return to military service in positions that don't require knowledge of orbital tracking operations. But before they complete this processing, they want my assessment, my professional judgment about what NORAD observed during those months when unknown objects appeared in Earth orbit. And they've made it clear that this testimony will be classified at levels that ensure almost no one will ever review it. So I'm going to be completely honest, not because I think it will change anything, but because someone needs to state clearly what we actually witnessed. The objects we tracked weren't human technology. I've spent 14 years analyzing orbital hardware from every nation with space capability. I know what Russian satellites look like. I understand Chinese orbital platforms. I'm familiar with classified as programs. What we observed was none of those things. The capabilities those objects demonstrated, the maneuvers they performed, the complete absence of launch detection or deployment mechanisms, all of it points to technology from sources beyond human engineering. Someone might claim this was classified technology that I wasn't briefed on, that human scientists have made breakthroughs that enable orbital insertion without detectable launches and maneuvering without observable propulsion. But that explanation requires believing that revolutionary physics was discovered, engineered into operational hardware, and deployed without any of the normal markers of human technology development. No research papers, no patent applications, no supply chains or manufacturing facilities, no test failures or incremental improvements, just sudden appearance of capabilities that violate known physics. The more rational explanation, though it's one that challenges every assumption about humanity's place in the universe, is that we're sharing orbital space with non-human technology, objects placed by civilizations or entities with scientific knowledge far beyond what humans have achieved. And the response from national security leadership has been to classify these observations and prevent their investigation, rather than acknowledge what they represent. I believe this suppression is based on assessment that public knowledge would create greater problems than maintaining secrecy. If people knew that unknown entities were operating technology in Earth orbit, that would raise questions about sovereignty and humanity's ability to control events in space domain. Better to pretend the objects don't exist than admit we can't explain or control them. But that suppression creates vulnerabilities. By refusing to acknowledge these objects, by preventing our space surveillance operations from tracking them, or creating blind spots in our orbital awareness. If these non-human objects are peaceful observers or scientific platforms, then ignoring them might be harmless. But if they represent threats or intelligence gathering by entities with capabilities beyond our defense systems, then pretending they don't exist is strategically dangerous. The pattern of incidents suggests increasing frequency. When I first joined NORAD, these events were rare enough that personnel might observe one during their entire career. By the time I was reassigned, we were detecting multiple unknown objects weekly. That acceleration suggests that whatever is placing hardware in our orbital space is expanding their operations, possibly preparing for something larger. The object's behavior shows clear intelligence and purpose. They don't drift randomly, they maneuver deliberately, they maintain formations. They perform demonstrations that showcase capabilities. All of that indicates intentional operation by entities with specific objectives. But we've made no attempt to communicate, to determine if these objects are hostile or peaceful. to understand what purpose they serve or what their presence in our orbital space means for humanity. The fragmentation and reconstitution incident in March suggests the objects have capabilities that extend beyond maneuvering and stealth. Something can apparently disassemble itself into dozens of pieces and then reassemble, without leaving permanent debris. That implies either technology that can control matter at scales we don't understand, or communication and coordination capabilities that enable distributed components to function as unified systems. Multiple analysts who observed these incidents have been reassigned or released. That pattern of dispersal isn't accidental. It's designed to prevent anyone from developing comprehensive understanding of what's occurring, by separating personnel who witness different incidents, by classifying each event in isolation, by preventing discussion or analysis across observations. The classification structure ensures that no single person can assemble a complete picture, but that strategy has costs. The analysts they've dispersed are the ones with most experience and deepest understanding of orbital tracking operations. Removing them from space surveillance roles degrades NORAD's capability to detect and respond to actual threats. If the objects we observed are the opening phase of something larger, if they represent intelligence gathering or preparation by entities planning more significant actions, then systematically removing our most experienced personnel weakens our ability to understand and respond. The intelligence agent, during one of our final conversations before my reassignment, said something that captured the fundamental problem with current approach. The classification isn't protecting national security. It's protecting leadership from having to acknowledge that they don't know what's happening and can't control it. He was right. The suppression of these incidents isn't based on legitimate security concerns. It's based on institutional unwillingness to admit that something is operating in Earth orbit with capabilities beyond human technology and purpose beyond our understanding. Better to classify and acknowledge and investigate. But you can't solve problems by pretending they don't exist. The objects will continue appearing regardless of whether we track them. Their capabilities will remain superior to our technology regardless of whether we study them. And their purpose, whatever it is, will unfold according to their objectives rather than our preferences. If you found this testimony compelling, leave a comment below with your thoughts. Share this video with others who need to hear this story, because the truth about what's operating in our orbital space deserves to be known. The satellite that doesn't exist is still up there. Multiple satellites now. If pattern analysis is accurate, operating with capabilities we can't explain, maneuvering with purpose we don't understand, and demonstrating through their very presence that the universe contains intelligence and technology far beyond what humanity has achieved. That truth has been classified. But classification doesn't change reality. It only delays recognition of what's already occurred and prevents preparation for what's inevitably coming. This is Battleground Times. Thanks for watching.